Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of our Nonprofit 2.0 podcast. Today we've got Sluga with us from PG Growth, and he's going to share a lot of really helpful information on what he's seen in the last 15 years around fundraising, around stewardship, and how organizations are more organizing. I'm Cherry, your podcast host. I'm the CEO of Clarity. We help organizations get clarity on their data. And Ed, share a little bit more about your background.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. PG Growth has been around for 15 years, but I've been in fundraising and not-for-profits really since I left university in 1989. 1990 was the first job I got in a not-for-profit and have been working either directly with them or as a vendor to them ever since. So 36 years. I've worked directly with small, medium, and large not-for-profits and have done every aspect of fundraising, but also capacity building. I think that's really important to what we're going to be talking a little bit about. And one of the things about our work at PG Growth and what my expertise is in is an area of fundraising called planned giving, also known as legacy giving, but I'm going to refer to it as planned giving throughout just to get everybody on the right page with that. And for us, I mean, the most important part of planned giving is about systems. It's about active, useful, and well-used systems because of the nature of planned gifts. They're transactional for sure, like all fundraising, but the transaction can take years, if not decades at times, to complete. And if you don't have really great systems in place and great capacity within the organization, you can lose track of these things. You can lose sight of them and you can lose revenue. So where PG Growth is a national organization working with charities and not-for-profits to build capacity primarily. That capacity then lends itself to be utilized in the various channels of fundraising. But for us, the program of planned giving is the most important one.
That's great. And from a plan giving perspective, how are you helping organizations set up their plan giving? Or do you only see organizations at a certain scale where they already have a program in place?
We take a very sort of egalitarian approach. What we mean by that is that anybody can do this. This is not stratification based on the size of the charity. My great mentor was someone who worked at a university, wrote a couple of books about planned giving, but he came from the church environment. And what he said was, even in this local church or synagogue or temple, if you have 100 loyal contributors every week, they contribute. If you asked all of them to make a planned gift, 10 of them would probably do it. And again, these are large gifts, by size. They tend to be tens of thousands of dollars plus. They would be considered major gifts with most organizations. So we work with the smallest of organizations that are very local, small community and stakeholder based, to the largest organizations that have worldwide impact. Everyone can do this. Yes, there's economy of scale. And of course, the larger organizations have more opportunity. But I can't tell you, Cherry, how many times we go into very large organizations and they're very under capacity when it comes to this area of fundraising. And then you go to a smaller or medium-sized organization and they're absolutely sophisticated in the way they approach this. And I think that's the key, is everyone can do this and everyone can build this capacity and these systems. They have to be right-sized for your organization. You can't steal from the largest university if you're the local regional group. It doesn't make any sense. You don't have the resources. But if you come into it from the point of view of your capacity and your opportunity and build it properly, you can benefit from it. So we work with all sorts of groups.
Yeah. And how do people get started?
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well. I think frankly, the first thing is to determine that you want to do this. I think that's the most important one. Believe it or not, some organizations don't see this as a viable program of fundraising.
Why is that? I would think every organization could benefit from
That's a
plan
great
giving.
question. And I do think there's a lot of self-determination that you can't do it. We're too small. Our stakeholders don't do this kind of fundraising. We hear this from cultural groups. Our cultural group doesn't do this kind of fundraising. That's patently not true. It's just that you're not doing it. There's fear around it. There's a fear of complexity. There's also fear of long-term engagement, and we're not really ready for that. I think a lot of them, and to be honest and fair to a lot of charities, they're mission driven. And a lot of times that mission is right now, today. And when you're entering into plan giving approach, you are
Mhm.
setting the course for years to come. And I'll give you an example of sort of the thinking about what our mission is of an organization and how they feel it precludes them from doing this. There's a large international, well-known refugee relief agency that we work with. And their goal when they started 70 years ago was to put themselves out of business in 3 to 5 years. So 70 years ago, they started and with a 3-year mandate, and then they stretched it to 5 and then a decade, all along thinking we're going to be so successful, we're going to put ourselves out of business. That never happened. And so urgency of the mandate and the mission is so compelling. They don't want to think about next year or the year after. Another good example is food banks. The need for food banks is increasing and increasing. You can see the need as it waits outside the door for the food bank to open. It's very hard to take those individuals so passionate about delivering that service to the community and say to them, now take some time to think about 20 years from now or 10 years. Really difficult. So there's a lot of that. It's all positive. It's meant from a good place, but all of them are essentially barriers that are put up by individuals within the organizations that they have to get past. Once you do that, it's also about opportunity and then structure. Learning what your opportunity is amongst your stakeholder base and then creating this capacity and structure to ensure that you can engage for the short, medium, and long term. And I know that's a lot of work that you do with organizations, taking maybe various bits and pieces of structure, combining it into one, or at least starting for some from scratch, starting this structure. Really very important because all of this is going to help you as you go forward. Only after you do these kinds of things, understanding that you want to do it, gain an understanding of the opportunity, build the structure, then you start to engage with individuals through marketing and through direct fundraising. So it's a process of capacity building on all of those levels. It really is linear. You have to do this, then we can do this, then we start to market, and then we start to benefit. So that's, I mean, generally speaking, how we do it. I can get more granular about it, but these are the steps we need to take.
Yeah, I want to come back to that decision-making piece. I hear you. And even from whether it's business or nonprofit, there's so much day to day that someone could be working on delivering the programs, delivering the services, calling and writing thank you letters to the donors that gave you a donation last month. But there's very little time built into our days to actually plan 10, 20 years down the road because again, we are hoping maybe one day food banks don't have to exist or when a refugee support organization doesn't have to exist after 3 to 5 years. But that the last 70 years have been any indication that hasn't been the case. And I find that to be such an interesting point.
I think you're right. And look, what we do know is that there is a deficit of capacity with most not for profits. We know that.
Mhm. Yes.
And they're unlike, as we also know, the structures of them are different than for-profit businesses. You know, if you're in the right type of business, venture capital and other sorts of investments are looking for you as opposed to the other way around. Not-for-profits are, no matter what jurisdiction you're in, are governed by different rules and also different risk factors. We have a deficit of resourcing, we have a deficit of investment opportunity, and we're risk averse. So we tend to focus on those things that we can see, line of sight, that deliver ROI in a measurable factor. Mostly that's within one fiscal year. And so that tends to be our focus. And the other part of it, though, I think is we are stuck a little bit in the cycle of 3 or 5 year strategic plans, which I think are important. Well, we've started calling them operational plans rather than strategic plans.
How do you define a strategic plan?
A strategic plan is, I think in the business world, it would be the big audacious goal. What's your big audacious goal? What's that big thing that you want to accomplish? You want to, in fact, eliminate the food insecurity in this community that we work in, to use that food banks analogy. So what do we need for that? First off, what's the timeline? It's not 3 to 5 years. It's going to be decades for us to get there because it's a decades long problem that got us here. It's going to be a decades long problem to get us out of this situation. So let's have a line of sight to that big audacious goal to achieve it. And that's well beyond that regular 3 to 5 year plan. And so we can say things that we say in strategic planning to eliminate this, to ensure that always happens no matter what. And these are the wonderful things. But then what are our goals for 5 years, and what are the operational objectives over those 5 years to incrementally move us to this big strategic imperative that our organization
Mhm.
has. So I think it's a little different. I think people are coming around to that, and it's a real benefit to come at it from the plan giving world, because we can say these things. We can say, well, we were working with an arts organization, and what we said was, we asked two questions when we're building this big audacious goal. And one of them is, if we woke up tomorrow and your organization no longer existed, not that it never existed, but it no longer existed, why should anyone care? Explain that to me. And that's very difficult, even for CEOs and board chairs and members to explain, because they're so within that moment of
Mhm.
they believe everybody understands the worth and the value of this organization. But the other question we ask is, I've got a donor sitting in front of you, and the donor is going to write you a check for the full amount of your need for 20 years from now. 20 years from now, what do you need? How much money and for what? And I'm going to write you a check for it. Explain what that need is and what amount that is. And again, most board chairs, most leaders of organizations can't tell you that. That's the rule. There are exceptions. A lot of universities can do that. A lot of institutional hospitals can do that. But a lot of smaller organizations can't. And it's not because they are unable to, is that they're not taking the time to think that way and get right back to this mission focus. Today is important. The long term isn't something we think about. It's not that it's not important, but something we don't think about. So I think when you structure and position some of the questions that you ask, you realize the 3 to 5 year strategic plan is really an operational plan. At the end of it, this is what our operations ought to look like as we move towards this big societal goal that we have, right? And that's ultimately what charities and not-for-profits are doing. They're fulfilling some societal goal. And so we've got a big part to play in building a civil society. And we have to have big dreams with that. And that's, I think, the difference between strategic planning and goal setting with objectives and operational plans to try and move incrementally towards achieving it. So once we get into that thinking in the long term, then we have to start thinking, how are we going to fund the long term? And so you have the current, the major, and then the long term. So the annual, major, and plan giving activity. It makes more sense suddenly.
Yeah, it does. And I think the framing that you use is also really helpful because you're essentially helping that ED really articulate and set their vision for what that organization's purpose is and vision is for the next 10 to 20 years. So if they're ever in front of that donor, or if they're going after someone who will set up plan giving, they need to articulate
Yes.
what it is that they're going to do and what is the vision. And right now we have a 5 year operational plan, but we need this plan to be continued for 20 years. When you were talking about universities having a better story to tell because they're in education, I was reminded of previous podcast I was listening to a long time ago where a donor came into Harvard and asked one of the deans of one of their faculties, I've got 15 or $150 million. What are you going to do with this money? And they're a little bit stumped, right? And that's what really you're trying to help address.
Absolutely. And I think it's okay to dream these big thoughts, these big aspirational goals. It's okay to do that. I always find it interesting when you are approaching these institutions, the Harvards of the world, these large, important bedrock institutions, and then you could be caught off guard because of the organizations that might be across from a donor saying what you just said. They're the ones most likely to be there. So the small local organization will not have a donor coming in saying, if I gave you $100 million, what would you do with it? What it would do is break them. They'd put them out of business. And we can talk about that because it is related to capacity. So they are in a better place to be thinking these things, but everyone can be. So when challenging those goal setting moments and challenging the orthodoxy of planning now, what we get is people literally thinking outside the box, thinking outside of the standard operating procedures. You do have to do that with a great deal of understanding that these are incredibly large goals that may never be attained, like the organization dealing with care for people who are refugees. The fact is that when you ask them, when's the refugee crisis in the world going to end? They do actually say in their very kind of realpolitik moments, never. We will always be necessary. But you don't want to say that out loud because it feels defeatist or it feels as though you're giving up hope to achieve something greater. It's like food banks and some of the other examples. What we want to do is obviously solve this problem, but we don't ever want to leave people without. And, we can get into a philosophical and political debate about if you're there to support, then it means that bodies with power don't take action to end it. Okay. One of the things about fundraisers is that we have to work within the current situation as opposed to the political aspect of it. I often say fundraisers are diplomats and charities are diplomatic entities. Governments are politicians, as we know, and government agencies are the ones, and now other power brokers, of course, that we know exist. They're the ones who make these decisions too. We work underneath this umbrella. That sometimes feels unfair. It feels a little bit as though we're powerless. We're not. We can do tremendous things to move people forward, live better lives, and have a better society. But we just have to operate as diplomats working within the system. So I think once challenged, then decision to do this actually becomes extraordinarily easy to make. And let me give you another analogy about planning, which is as you enter into planning your investments, we are always asked about what risk tolerance you might have when we're building a portfolio of investments, whether you're contributing to long-term retirement plans or whether you're actually playing in the marketplace. So most charities have a low risk tolerance, and they should have a low risk tolerance. Of course, individual investors can be extraordinarily risky in the way they invest their money. That's their business. And if they succeed, wonderful. If they don't, they understand the risks. But when you have a portfolio that's risk averse, you tend to have a portfolio investment that is balanced. And what we mean by that is there are some growth opportunities, but there's also some very solid and very long-term, perhaps boring investments, but they're there nonetheless. And they're there to ensure that the long-term security of your investment needs are met. So growth and long-term sustainability. It's kind of like the Warren Buffett way of looking at your investments. And it's also when you're looking at revenue generation opportunities within charities, you have to also have this balanced approach. And annual fund is sort of an aggressive acquisition. Major giving is about filling up coffers. And of course, planned giving is for the rainy day, for the future, for your long-term vision. So I think all of that comes into focus when we start thinking differently as charity.
And when you talk about a balanced, let's say, revenue model
Yeah.
for a nonprofit, what would you say that range would be for each of the areas? Do you have a suggestion on where people should try to get to?
In terms of their investment in these areas, do you mean?
Well, in their investment, but also for the organization that's setting up planned giving, how much should planned giving make up?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. So I'll talk a little bit about the revenue balance, but then the expenditure balance. So the revenue balance can be as much as a third, a third, a third. So annual, major, planned. There are some organizations we work with, 20, 25, 35% of the revenue comes from planned gifts, realized on a year in and year out basis. That's possible and is something you should target. But anywhere between 25 and 33% of all revenue in the door is your target. It will take years to get there. It's not a quick fix, but that's a target. But the difference is the expenditure on planned giving. So, in the fundraising world, we use cost per dollar raised. And the cost per dollar raised for planned gifts is somewhere between sort of 8 and 10%, and 8 cents on the dollar, 10 cents on the dollar, where annual fund would be more in line with 45 to 55 cents cost per dollar. So you're spending far less for the same number of revenue. What's that mean? Of course, the contribution to the bottom line is much larger, right? The net revenue is much higher. I think really those are targets, but even somebody working primarily in planned giving, I would go into an organization and try to make this as sustainable and efficient and as low cost as possible, because we are spending dollars today for future benefit. So we always have to keep that in mind. But guess what? There's a very well-worn path to actually achieving this. It's not magic. It's actually very predictable. And if we walk down this route, we can get to these numbers very, very quickly. So there's revenue distribution, but there's also expenditure distribution. And that expenditure distribution is really quite low with the investment in plan.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk about, we've talked about the decision, we've talked about why it's important. Let's talk about for the organization that doesn't have any planned giving right
Yes.
now, and they want to set up their first iteration of a planned giving program. What can they do on their own to either get this set up? Of course, they can reach out to you. What are some steps that they can take on their own to get from that 0 to 1?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of initial testing and initial do-it-yourself kind of approaches that can definitely be done. And I'll give you some of them. So first off, and this is really important, that you have to be able to search your database a little bit and have this functioning capacity to do that, and I know that's an area that's very close to what you do on an ongoing basis. That's very, very helpful. So that's the first step, is take a look and start looking for within your own donor base and database or CRM, whatever you're calling it, do some initial look. Do we have a certain amount of donors that are giving to us on an ongoing basis, year in and year out? What's the number of that? Let's find our community to speak to about this. Okay. So that's the first thing. Then we want to put in to place some quiet announcements of planned giving, and then some more direct engagement. The quiet announcement of planned giving is using your digital retail space, using your website. Do you currently have information on your website that explains that you are in this business, that you are raising money in this way? That's, for me, one of the most important first steps, because of two reasons. One is, when you do start to actively engage with donors, they're going to come and take a look to see what this is all about when it comes to your organization. That's the first thing. The other thing is that when they do go and see their lawyer or someone else, insurance advisor, financial planner, depending on what kind of gift they are creating, they're going to also check. They're going to say, let me take a quick look. And they're going to bring the charity up online and see if they are actually in this form of fundraising. So that's something simple that the majority of organizations can do. It does not need to be complex. It needs to simply be very easily found. It needs to state some very, very basic things. And it needs to say, we're in this planned giving business. So we do this kind of work. We accept these gifts. We're here to help. Send us a note. Here are the types of gifts we will accept, things of that nature. That, again, you do not need an outside vendor to help you do that. It's very do. So that's the first thing. So you've got you've got a kind of opportunity. So you've made sure that this is the right thing for us to do. You've set up your digital front door so people can reach out, and then we can do some initial testing. And it's quite simple to do. We take that data, and then let's get back to that notion of 100 donors. If you have 100 loyal donors, then why don't we just write them a letter saying, you know what? Our charity is starting to get involved in this kind of fundraising, wondering if you might be interested in having a conversation about this. Again, maybe there's some additional materials within that letter that you send out. Can be an email, but it's got to be direct. It's got to be targeted at the individual, and send it out and see what kind of responses you get. Do you get from the 100? Do you get 10 people who say they're interested, you're on the right track. So test it a little bit. There's that activity. Once you've done that, then you can take the next step, which is very do it yourself, and make it somewhat ubiquitous throughout the organization. Try to make it a social norm. So in your direct mail, if you're using that methodology for annual fund, on your e-blasts, make sure that it's mentioned. For more information about a planned gift to our organization, click here. Just start doing that very low level, very kind of broadcast marketing. Put notification opportunities throughout all of your marketing as a secondary or a tertiary messaging. Once you give us an annual fund or become part of our monthly donation club, would you also like to learn more about this? Again, very simple, directed internally. Likely you can do it yourself as a professional or seek out help on your team. You don't have to go outside. Make sure that you're developing the fundamentals of a passive program, which is about setting up shop to be able to receive these gifts. Anybody can do this. Most fundraisers that I've met have the ability to do this. It's very fundamental. It's easily searchable online. You can go to your favorite charity that you donate to, or the university that you went to, or the hospital that your kids were born at, or that you go to for diagnostics. They likely have some of this online. I'm not telling you to steal anything, but take a look and see what they're doing and say, I can do that. So you can do that fundamentally, that fundamental work as a starting point. Some of the next steps are a little more complicated, and you might seek out external help to kind of do a larger engagement of your stakeholders. But those initial steps, anyone can do. Anyone who's fundraising can do.
Yeah. And if I can summarize, there are a few steps that people can take is, first of all, hopefully they have a clean set of donor data
Yeah.
that they can draw on and search from and gather insights from. And if they don't, they can certainly come reach out to us.
Yes.
We have built lots of donor databases and integrated with all sorts of different tools. But for that donor data, once you isolated some people who might be interested, start sending them some feelers, do some research on what local hospitals or universities are doing in terms of their planned giving. And you take some of their language, make it your own, and start updating some of your marketing and your website to just give people a channel in case someone is interested and you have somewhere to send them to if they reply to that email. Okay, so that's kind of from 0 to 1 in order to get an initial foundation set up for planned giving. What if someone already has that and they're wanting to go from 1 to 2, because we are called Nonprofit 2.0? So how can they take their planned giving program from 1.0 to 2.0? How do you come in and help set them up into something more sophisticated?
So what we do is we first take a look at their capacity. And again, this gets back to capacity and building capacity. And we do it on 8 main areas. But, it sounds complicated, but it's not. There is that leadership commitment. If we build it, or will we have resources to build it? And if we do have resources to build it, will it be committed to for the long term? We've already talked about the long-term nature. So we do have to get an understanding from leadership that we're into this business and we're not going to deviate from this business. So that doesn't mean a big expenditure of dollars. It doesn't mean committing, vast sums of money over the next 10 years. It's just, we're going to keep doing this. This is something we're going to focus attention on. Then we're going to understand the budget. What is our budget? What can we do? We're going to work on that. We're going to take a look a little bit at how we engage with donors and from a marketing context, right? And then also, how are we going to move them along through the marketing to fundraising? Who's in charge of this program? Like every other business within any other organization, a business unit, you need someone to drive it forward. It can be a full-time person dedicated directly and only to planned giving. Most of the time, it's someone who has, as part of their job responsibilities, also doing this. But we need someone to be the champion and to be the lead. That needs to be determined, and that's what we do. Then we also take a look a little bit about the use of data. How are we using the data? How will we use the data as we go forward? Again, if someone expresses interest in a gift today, it might take us years before we secure a gift. So being able to put that into our CRM, use the CRM to prompt us to engage again, and then capture the data from that engagement and continually feed our CRM, enriching that data is extraordinarily important as we go. And you having that database to do that, or the systems, and again, a database, CRM systems, you have to have a set system to do that. And then there's a couple of other areas that we need to look at. One is about what we call stewardship and recognition. Stewardship is if someone informs you that they've created a gift, because that gift is pledged for the future, we have to make sure that they don't run off and go somewhere else or change their mind. So we have to steward them through that process. And then we have to recognize them. That's when we receive the gift. It's a very profound thing that someone's done. They've included you in their will. By the way, when they include you, they've made a determination to exclude others. We don't know who they are. Could be other charities, things like that. So you're in. So we have to recognize that contribution in a really wonderful way. Not expensive, not overly solemn or anything like that, but we have to absolutely do that. But when the gift is also comes in, we have to be able to, and this is one of the most important things, is the administration of the gift, because those gifts can take years to administer. So we have to have that in place. So these are all areas that we will look at, and you can do this yourself internally if you have the skills and knowledge. And what that does is it allows us to plot a 3-year plus plan to start rolling out a program to its greatest capability. And we work in four main areas, I'm sorry. There's this broadcast activity we just talked about, your website, various other things. Then there's direct targeted communication. We call that midcasting. Then there's fundraising. Someone says, I'm interested. Somebody has to be talking to that person. It's the fundraising activity. Then it goes into stewardship. So we need to develop a plan that takes all of that into consideration, and then we launch into the marketplace. Now, again, this is, it seems complex. It's not complex. It's things you're doing already. But what we're doing is deliberately setting this up specifically to plan giving. And although we can come in and do that for organizations, there are a lot of really smart professionals within organizations that can do all of this work. They need the support, the resources, and the commitment by the organization, and they can have it happen.
And I wanted to ask a bit about that recognition piece. What is appropriate recognition? Do you feature them in your email? Do you send them a gift or send their family members a gift? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because one of the things I'll pull back a little bit, and there's been lots of research done by various folks. My colleague, Ken Ramsey, who's our senior counsel, has done a lot of research. A gentleman named Dr. Russell James has done a lot of research on what motivates donors to give. And what they've found is that the main motivation for donors to give is alignment with the mission of the organization. What this organization is doing is important to me, and I want to support it for the future. And that's true. That is the main motivation. But what we've found in our practical work is that people are complex too, right? And so they have a main motivation, but they have other motivations as well. And one of them is to be recognized, to leave some remembrance of themselves through this gift. So I think when we approach stewardship and recognition, this is a moment where we can't listen entirely to our donors who would say, I don't need any recognition. We have to say, we know what human nature is. And yes, you don't want it and you would never say it, but we still need to create it. So what's appropriate? It depends on the organization. This is where your organization matters, because with those universities, perhaps those hospitals, we have bricks and mortar to utilize. And it is really quite profound when a name is found. And just for those who sort of have the ability to walk around a university campus, and if you live near a university, maybe you work at a university, maybe you go frequent to university, as an alumni every once in a while, or a college, you see these moments of sort of names on walls, and lots of people like that. They think about that. So that's a wonderful thing. We have an environmental conservation group that we work with. And what they do is they plant a tree in your name. They tell you where they plant it, and they tell you what kind of tree it is. And, you never be able to go visit your tree, but you know that you're sort of placed in something that's going to outlive you and is going to be there. And there are all sorts of things in between. Now, the stewardship part of it is where a gift comes in. Well, can we send a gift? Years ago, it was lapel pins and various things like that, where we really do use that to show that we understand this commitment that's been made. So that's a stewardship activity. And there's lots of really interesting things that we can do there. We work with a hospital foundation that actually did a really interesting stone and metal sculpture that they send, very small, but it would look lovely on your desk or on your bookshelf. It doesn't even cost very much, but it's really profound for them and the area that they work within. But it's that long-term recognition. Some organizations don't have bricks and mortar, can't plant a tree. What are they going to do? Online books of remembrance. There are all sorts of ways to be smart, to use technology, videos, for example, honoring people on the website, a name scroll on websites that are constantly updated. Lots of opportunity. It's really a creative moment that you can reach out as an organization. You can reach into your own creative thoughts and minds and bring that forward. So lots of different options.
That's great. I also want to touch on that data piece in terms of stewarding the data, because these planned gifts are going to come for many, many years. So there's lots of different touch points, whether to make sure the payments have indeed come in, whether to recognize them continuously. How do you handle that? And how do you encourage other folks to handle that piece?
Yeah, that's, for us, this is a capacity building moment. And we actually go very, if I may call it that, old school, where we actually ensure that we are doing more than simply setting up the system within the CRM. We are actually writing it down and making sure that there is a manual around this. It doesn't have to be printed or anything like that, but it's very defined with definitions on all of the codes or indicators that we would use on a constituent or donor record. And what do they mean? And what does that mean? What does it indicate for us? So if a constituent has on their record that they've indicated they're interested in a gift, we will have a written kind of definition of what that interest means, how long we want them to be in that interest stage. When do we expect them to move into intention or gift? When do we move out? So we'll write that down. Some organizations were very rudimentary. We have 3 codes: interest, intent, gift. That's all. Because, first and foremost, they're not using their CRM in a particularly complex way. So we don't want to,
Or maybe they don't have a CRM
or they don't have a
yet.
CRM. Absolutely. And all of those things can be kept on God forbid, an Excel spreadsheet on your desktop. You and I are against that, but some folks still have that, right? So you can do that. There are other organizations that will have much more complex things where they've expressed interest in a life insurance policy. That's a different code than they've expressed interest in a gift of a bequest in their will. So we code everything up to the greatest degree that the organization is able to handle, but we write it down and define it. And, years ago, when I first got into fundraising, we used to use the term living document. It was something we used all the time, which only meant that we'd go back and we'd edit this document on an ongoing basis. And it really needs to be that. As we expand, as we become more sophisticated and complex in our approach, we can expand this. And I'll give you an example where we were working with an independent school, usually called a private school. And when it comes to donors, they have 4 natural constituents, but we didn't actually break them up originally. We just called them prospects for planned gifts. Once they got more sophisticated, we split them up into their 4 natural constituents, which are older alumni, younger alumni, former parents, current parents, right?
Sounds reasonable.
Sounds reasonable, right? But then what we were able to do is we could code them differently. And so if we can know is that if a former parent was interested, we could approach them differently than if a new alumni was interested, because they have different interests, different stages of life, different connections with the school. So you can expand on it. But we only did that after establishing first people who are interested. And we treated them all the same because there wasn't a critical mass to change that. But as more engagement happened, there was more opportunity and more, not stratification, but differentiation for each of these. And so, for example, if we were sending another document to engage and perhaps cultivate and solicit to former parents, we'd try and highlight a former parent. Here's a former parent who's done this kind of gift. They're just like you. Their child or children went there at these ages. Now they're gone. They're happy and healthy and thriving. And, they've decided to leave a gift. Wouldn't you decide to leave a gift? Which is a completely different story than to the new alumni. It was like, well, you just left and you've got a great career and you love your school still. You come back for all the reunions. Maybe you could consider this kind of gift. So it's a different approach as you go. So using your CRM and having the capacity to use the CRM and have everyone use the CRM, so that means it's got to be functional, right? As you know, is one of the most important things in fundraising. Your data is super important, and having a functioning capacity around that, and I really mean functioning, right? Because you can have the most sophisticated, wild and wide-ranging CRM, but if nobody uses it, it's not worthwhile, as you know
Mhm.
better than I do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many, regional community-based nonprofits have come to me and say, "Hey, I think we need a Salesforce," or "We were looking at a Salesforce implementation." And I was thinking, you're 12 people right now. That might be pretty big shoes to be able to step into. That you have some funding and you're able to afford a Salesforce project, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the right tool for you.
I heard this just recently, and I'd love to get your take on this, where someone said, they're using currently a CRM designed specifically for fundraising, and they find it very difficult to utilize. And what they've been saying is we're going to be switching over to Salesforce. I'll just use that because that's exactly what the example was. And they basically said, once we get to Salesforce, everything's going to be fine. And you do smile a little bit and think, no, it's not going to necessarily be fine. It could be fine, but it's about utilizing it. And you must hear that all the time where people feel, well, I'll just buy this other product and that'll make it all better, right?
Well, it's just garbage in, garbage out with the CRM. So being able to use it is one thing, and really encouraging the team to use it consistently is one thing. And then having the right system that's actually meant for your custom workflow is also really important, because that planned giving piece, I don't think many CRMs will do that well, especially if someone has a decently large program where they have a significant amount of funding going into or going through plan giving. I imagine there's just different types of touch points. There's a annual or maybe quarterly check-in that's very much customized to each person. So as your people leave an organization and as people come and go, you need a hub where things are actually properly tracked. And I think in Airtable, there's a very natural way for you to track a donor, the plan giving amounts. Maybe they've made a plan for 10 years, all the transactions that you're expecting, so that your team can use that 10, 20 years going into the future, because it's not a spreadsheet on one person's computer that's tracking plan giving, because your CRM doesn't actually fit that requirement for a 10-year or a 10-year
Correct.
cycle.
And, I think you bring up a really good point. And I think it's sort of the origin of a lot of the CRMs that are utilized in fundraising right now. And, I don't want to harp on Salesforce. They're a good product and they're good people. But the fact is, it's Salesforce. Sales is in the name. These are not sales. These are about donor journeys. And I know that within sales, and I'm someone who does sales regularly for our firm, that it's about relationships, and having happy customers means repeat customers. But there's a difference when it comes to the notion of a gift, because a gift can bring in so many complex areas, right? It can be the annual, it can be a major, it can be a family gift, it can be a gift that comes from partly the family pocket, if I can call it that, partly from their corporation and partly from their foundation. It is so different and unique. And a lot of them, the origin is about sales. And they've tried to turn them in or to kind of after the fact make them work in this area. And I think some of them can, but it's really clunky as opposed to looking at a solution that understands it from the beginning and is created to follow that through. That's my feeling about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I want to give you this example from a previous client we had. It was a Christian nonprofit organization, but they essentially operate a little bit like a bank because all they do is planned giving. And then they essentially host their donors' funds and hold on to it until they're ready to give. So, from a tax perspective, it works out well for donors. And people are literally giving buildings, they're giving art, they're giving different types of assets in addition to monetary dollars. So what they had to track is all the different entities, the donor that's tied to, sometimes multiple donors, or like you said, a family. And that donation, sometimes it could be committed and actually be given in 3 years because maybe it's a building and then they want to hold on to the building for 3 years. But from donor tax planning purposes, they want to let it go in 3 years and they would want to move that asset into another holding structure. So there's a lot of different reasons why people choose to give, the timing of that gift. So this organization was tracking different types of gifts, different people, different organizations, different timing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we built was a custom system that organized all of that into one place because they just couldn't use Salesforce or they couldn't use an off-the-shelf tool.
Yes.
I'm not saying all of planned giving is going to get to that level of complexity. Of course, they're probably outside of the norm in terms of what an individual organization would need, but it just highlights the different types of data and how different pieces of data can relate when it comes to planned giving. And it's when you're using Salesforce or another uh, HubSpot or another tool, it's really set up to sell one person. That sale will go through. It's done. It's won. And sure, you can create another opportunity, but you don't see that entire connection of all the different threads of the different people, of the different organizations that might get involved.
Yes, that's interesting too. Just a little note, I think it works right into the monitoring of it in the way that you say, is again, through research, what we know is that once someone has made a pledge of a planned gift and they've informed the organization, their actual annual giving goes up. And so how do we also engage with that? If we know that's a motive, like a donor habit, which is create a planned gift, start giving increasingly more money on an annual basis, how do we make sure our system is set up to trigger that? And I use trigger with big quotations around it, but make sure that we are understanding that this is a habit of donors and that we're engaging in a way to move that forward. So it's something that's, again, complex with lots of touch points, as you just said. And, not everyone is set up to do that. So data becomes incredibly important. And one of the things we've learned over the years, and I'm sure you have, is that everyone's data is a mess. And that's something that I can say with great clarity. It's the rule rather than the exception that they need work on their data. But the other thing that comes with it, no one thinks that's the case. Everyone thinks that everyone's data is in great shape except theirs, right? So they don't want to admit it. They don't want to say our data's in need of professional supports and help. So I think, not-for-profits, charities out there, if you feel like your data's, not in a great shape, it's okay. It's okay. Most people are there. Seek out help. Like you got to this place because you didn't seek out help. Seek out some help. It'll help you. And it'll help all of these areas, including the planned giving side of it. It's fundamental work that needs to be done.
And we've got lots of clients who are nonprofits and they need better data because they need more donations. And if they have large donors, they're trying to keep track of their programs so that they can actually show their donors, hey, we are doing the thing that we say we are doing, and this is the impact, and these are the surveys that have come in, and this is how many people we've helped. And by the way, there is a wait list of X amount of people we couldn't help. So that just paints a picture of we've been able to provide jackets for 500 kids this year, but there are 275 still on the wait list. You know, the $10,000 that you gave us or $100,000 that you gave us, 85% of it went to programming, 15% went to our staffing costs. So is there a potential we could get more? And when you have the right data, it just paints such a great picture to be able to tell that story, whether it's to an individual donor who might be upping their gift next year or to your government funders who
Hmm.
require it.
Absolutely. And I guess the other part from the plan giving point of view, when getting back to some of the questions that you were asking earlier, it's easy to make the case for investment in a plan giving program if you don't have one, if you have good data. Because as you know, within the data is all of the information that's required to make a business case for investment in a new way of engaging with donors. That's why I said fundamentally, you said, where do you fundamentally start? You fundamentally start with data. You need to start there. Now, I don't want to put anyone off if your data isn't great. Just mention that most people's data isn't in a great spot. So you can move forward. But if you can clean up your data, that's a wonderful reason to do it, which is it's so much easier to go to leadership, to go to the board of directors and say, we need some more investment and here's why, and show them some great data that's coming out of your own donor information.
And if the folks who are listening, you're not sure which areas you need help with, we have created a data health check that you can fill out. It's a
Perfect.
2 to 3 minute form. You fill out what tools are you currently using, what some gaps are for you, and what are some of your priorities. So you can check that out, and we give you a 90-day plan to help you self-diagnose, do some work on your own, and hopefully get you into a better spot with your data. I want to come back to the plan giving piece for a moment. What are some of the big hurdles you see when people are actually going about implementing their program?
I think one of the biggest hurdles, and this is from an internal point of view, and it's related to the yearly kind of budgeting that we do and the yearly measurables that we have, metrics, whatever term you want to use, is the question often arises, if we're going to spend this much money this year, how much money will we be getting in? So the return on this year, what's the return on investment? So that's a symptom of people really truly not understanding what plan giving is. We're governed by boards of directors of passionate people who want to make the organization achieve its mission or at least advance towards fulfilling its mission in the community. A lot of them don't know how to run a not-for-profit and don't know very much about fundraising. When they come to looking at the plan giving program, they'll often ask, what's our return on investment? And we can provide a return on investment, but it's going to be 3 to 5 years down the line. It will not be in this fiscal year. So it's a little bit of knowledge within an organization and then the kind of advancement of that knowledge so that people understand what a program really means, how it kind of returns on that investment and brings in value to the organization. It's a huge impediment. That's a number one. I think a second one is related to that, which is staff movement. Lots of not-for-profits have lots of staff movement. And, we may actually have that internal champion on the staff side who knows what they're doing, knows the program, knows the steps that have been taken. And then they are hired away by a larger not-for-profit to do other things or leave for some other reason. So a lot of times there will be a gap at that moment where it's like, well, we don't have someone to drive this forward. So it goes against, both of those things go against the long-term notion of what we're doing. And I often will say, if somebody in the annual fund moves, you keep on doing your annual fund. You have to keep on doing the plan giving work. But those are our two main ongoing issues that come as barriers to organizations continuing their commitment. Now, I feel like we as a company have lots of opportunities to support organizations for both of those things. Board development, board education, and senior management development education on this area is something we do all the time. to make sure that there's an understanding from leadership's point of view. But also, we'll even do interim staffing to ensure that programs do not stop or pause when there is a staff change. And we started that service simply because of this issue that we've seen over the years. So those are real impediments. But again, if you're thinking that long term, which we talked about, those impediments are not impediments. They're not barriers. They're just, we have to get over these objections because we have this long term vision. So, but those I would suggest are the two main things that we butt up against as we're helping charities and not-for-profits build their program.
Mm-hmm. It does sound like a big piece of your work is that senior management education, the board education, so people can stick with it and have patience, because as people do planning for this kind of plan giving, it's not a snap decision on whether or not I should buy a water bottle. It's usually there's different people involved and it takes a long time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think, there is a lot of managing up. If you get a good champion internally who's at a director level or a VP level, and they really know that this is an important type of fundraising, they can manage up. Internal experts or knowledge area leads are really important. I don't want to discount them. They tend to be on side most of the time. They tend to get it.
Yeah, sounds like the case. Well, how do people find you, whether it's for that education piece or to take their program from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2?
Yeah, you can reach us at pggrowth.com. That's our website. Have a look. You can also find me, Ed Sluga, on LinkedIn. Reach out to me that way, or you can send me an email, ed@pggrowth, pggrowth.com. Any one of those ways, reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you and give you a look-see on this type of program, how you can build your capacity to achieve it, and maybe we could even help you along the way.
That's perfect. And once again, my name is Cherry, and I'm the CEO of Clarity. We help folks get clarity on their data. So whether you're confused about your donor data or trying to get your plan giving into a more sophisticated stage with some custom systems, you can reach out to us at clarybase.com.